While it's good to have a break from the overdone UK, US and Germany trio, that doesn't mean routes based in other countries are guaranteed to be outstanding. This time, I'm discussing an example of a route that's outside the aforementioned trio while still being a dud, in my opinion. This is the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe line in South Africa, and to be clear, just because I don't like the in-game route, that doesn't mean I don't like South African railways in general. Indeed, I've seen two 25NC class 484s and a GMAM Garrett in real life without having to leave New Zealand, and I was amazed at the sheer size of those locomotives, considering that they're on 3-foot 6-inch gauge too. For further clarification, this video is not, I repeat, not, a personal attack on the developers behind this add-on. This add-on was the second payware South African route in Train Simulator, releasing in September 2016 and costing a steep 36 New Zealand dollars at full price. This add-on is not a Dovetail Games product, as it was made by Johan Steam instead. The product description on Steam is riddled with cringeworthy and phoned-in adjectives, presumably included in an attempt to hype up a route with a great concept but subpar execution. You get the 67km or 42-mile long route from George to Knysna in the Western Cape province of South Africa. I don't know exactly what time period this route is set in, but I do know that the real line closed in 2006 due to damage from heavy flooding. Although the line is fairly short, it takes at least 2 hours to complete a full run due to the severe speed limits. For example, there's a road rail bridge across the Taos Riviera that has a blanket speed restriction of only 5 km per hour. Scenic highlights along the line include the Caimans River Bridge, Swartvlei and Sedgefield Lagoon, spiral loops at Haukamma, and low bridges across Knysna River. Only one locomotive is included with this pack, and that's the South African Railways 24 class 284 tender engine, supplied in both clean and weathered states. Compared to the New Zealand Railways Dubs A, JA and KB classes, the functionality of the 24 is very basic. But this means that the 24 is relatively easy to drive, in stark contrast to the JA and KB, which, in my opinion, are absolute pigs to drive. They're so advanced that they could give smokeboxes locomotives a run for their money, and I've never really been a fan of these crazy advanced engines. This model of the 24 class is reasonably well detailed, but the situation is spoiled by the horrible washed out textures, especially on the footplate. Just look at this rendition of the lubricator for a start. It looks more like a weird chocolate bar that's been covered in wood varnish. The 24 was looking outdated even by 2016 standards, and the details in this game have come a long way in the last 8 years, as we can see with the JA's lubricator, whose design looks very similar to the 24's lubricator. The footplate on the 24 class really does look horrible, and it doesn't help that there are only 2 camera angles, in either the fireman or driver's seat. The sounds are of a similarly low quality, with the chuff sound possibly reused from the default Kuju era Black 5 or 7F. And I swear I've heard of this exact same whistle sound on a locomotive that was included in the Ancient Trains Murchison 2 pack. I think it was the Baltimore and Ohio C16 shunter, of all things. I'm confused as to why the developers reused existing sounds instead of recording them from a real 24 class locomotive. And as if that wasn't bad enough, The coaches and wagons are borderline silent when they're in motion. In other words, they have absolutely no realistic running sounds, unlike, for example, the wagons that come with most of Victory Works' locomotive packs. And even the VW add-ons released before Outeniqua Choo Tjoe, such as the GWR Small Prairies, had those good running sounds. They lie in stark contrast to what you hear, or rather don't hear, from the 24 class and her rolling stock. I'm not happy with the inclusion of only one locomotive, a problem that can be found on all three payware South African routes that are currently in the game, because it makes the route feel very boring and monotonous when you're driving the same locomotive every time, especially in the default scenarios, and with that locomotive being the only one you can run on the route while still having it be realistic. I prefer to see a good variety of motive power included with the route, or, at the very least, have more engines released later as separately sold add-ons. Why that has never happened for any of these South African routes is anyone's guess, and for reference, the other two run from Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith and Worcester to Mosul Bay. But they are both incredibly long with poor scenery details, and I rarely, if ever, drive on those routes anymore. The Pietermaritzburg route, which was released in July 2014, is 191 kilometres long and comes with the 6E1 electric locomotive, while Worcester to Mosul Bay was released in February 2020. It is a ridiculous 320 kilometres long, and only comes with the Class 37/30's diesel locomotive. Incidentally, this thing looks an awful lot like KiwiRail's DFT/DFB class, but the 37/30's is let down by her rubbish sounds and ugly washed out colours. Shifting the subject back to South African steam locomotives, I would have preferred a route that included the 15F class 482 or 25NC class 484, especially the latter, after seeing 3432 and 3508 in real life. I reckon the devs should have included at least one more locomotive with the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe, namely the 19D class 482, even though she looks very similar to the 24 class. As for the passenger coaches and freight wagons, this lot is of a similarly mediocre quality to the 24 class. You get the L-32 and O-38 passenger coaches, N7 guards van, STJ-15, SMJ-2 and LB-2 freight wagons. The STJ-15 is used to carry logs, which, in this case, have really ugly textures that put me off from running these wagons. Meanwhile, the LB-2 wagons carry large rubbish containers, and the SMJ-2 carries shipping containers. Although the container model looks very basic, and consequently reminds me of the old Kuju era assets. One of the few good things I can say about the L-32, O-38 and N7 coaches is that, at the very least, they are not reused from the older Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith route. That pack is not of a particularly high quality either, especially where the scenery and sounds on the 6E1 are concerned. And now I will demonstrate the sounds on the 6E1 locomotive. Although it's not even slightly realistic, I still like to run Japanese or New Zealand rolling stock on the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe from time to time, because those countries also use 3-foot 6-inch gauge track. If there's one good thing I can say about the really basic scenery, it means that the route still runs smoothly, in stark contrast to the decent looking Midland line, on which the experience is ruined by the excessive amounts of 3D trees as distance scenery, which results in frequent lag. Despite the route's relatively short length, it takes a ridiculously long time to cover the whole thing, at least 2.5 hours. This is due to the severe speed limits, but even so, I doubt that many people would have the patience to do a run this long in one shot, and that goes for the Antelope Valley line in TSW4 as well. Not helping the situation is the fact that there are only 3 intermediate stations between George and Knysna, namely Wilderness, Sedgefield, and Halkama. There's also a disused station at Ferry No, just round the corner from the Tulls Riviere Bridge. The line is mostly single track, but there are 8 crossing points throughout the route. However, 5 of those crossing points do not have stations, but there are no signals anywhere on this route, so good luck to anyone trying to set up AI trains in a standard or career scenario. I've already mentioned the names of the 3 intermediate stations, while the loops that don't have active stations are Serpentine, Douwe Rivier, Rondevlei, Rachterveer, and Keitersnek. And I sincerely apologise if I've butchered any of those names, especially since I'm not at all familiar with Afrikaans. At least I think that's the right name for that language. Dare say someone will correct me if I'm wrong. There's a 1 in 50 descent round the first curve out of George and past the coal loader, followed by the incline down to Victoria Bay that gets as steep as 1 in 33 and even 1 in 22 at one point. The gradients are often steeper than 1 in 100, but the steepest section of the line is a short bit of 1 in 22, which lies 6.42 kilometres west of Wilderness. There's another short section of 1 in 22 on the descent into Halkama from the western end of the station, although it's debatable whether or not this can really be called a station due to its complete lack of a platform. As for the speed limit, it only gets as high as a pathetic 40 km per hour, in stark contrast to the Pietermaritzburg to Ladysmith route, where trains can go as fast as 90 km per hour. Once you get out of the 20 km per hour speed limit in George Yard, the limit only goes up to 30 for most of the route, and there are no crossing loops between George and Wilderness. Then the speed limit goes up to 40 km per hour at Rondevlei, but goes back down to 30 at the 49 km peg, which lies 2.33 km west of Halkama. Then it goes back up to 40 at Brenton, just 3.57 km from Knysna. The final change in the speed limit is at the entrance to Knysna Yard, where it goes back down to 20 km per hour. Driving on this route can be incredibly boring due to the severe speed limits and terrible scenery details. It's one thing for a route to be of a bad quality, since that at least gives people something vaguely interesting to talk about, but it's even worse if it's boring and there's not many remarkable traits to begin with. Obviously, I am unable to verify the accuracy of the scenery on this route, but I still think that the details are very basic. Sometimes you'll even come across reused Kuju era assets, which make the route look and feel much older than it actually is. There aren't very many custom assets throughout the route, but I did notice the station building at George. Indeed, these rare custom assets look so much better than the reused Kuju ones, to the point where they almost look out of place. For comparison, here's what George Station looks like in real life, as seen on Google Street View. As for what I think is more important, be it immersive scenery or consistently smooth frame rates, I'm split down the middle. But I don't think trying to get high frame rates should be an excuse for scenery that's as bad as what you see on the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe. While laggy routes are quite annoying, looking at you Midland Line, I still think it's possible to have a balance between good scenery and smooth frame rates, instead of sacrificing one for the other. Take the Freeware Esthwaite branch route for example. This may be around 22 miles shorter than the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe, but the scenery is an awful lot better, for the most part. There's a lot more clutter around the stations and depots, and the route doesn't feel barren at all. In my opinion, it puts the scenery on the three Payware South African routes to shame. Even when I was just looking around the town of George, I was put off by the bare-bones scenery, which doesn't extend too far beyond the track. However, there's at least one detail that I do like, besides the station building, and that's the coal loader with these little minecarts on it. I also noticed this little asset near the coal loader that looks like a pizza oven, but I don't know what this is supposed to be. There's a railway museum just north of George Station, but without prior knowledge, it's harder to tell that this building on the in-game route is supposed to be the museum. Other areas of bad scenery include the atrocious rock textures around the tunnels near Victoria Bay, as well as this spot just east of Wilderness, where a single house model has been copied and pasted 20 times. It looks like the devs were pulling a TSW before TSW was even a thing. And when I called at Sedgefield on the run to Knysna, I was shocked to realise that the in-game rendition of the station is a complete joke. There's no exit modelled at the station, let alone a path to the nearby Earl Street. That's spelt U-I-L, and as I said earlier, I do apologise for butchering the local names. Here's what the street looks like in real life. And here's how it looks in Train Simulator. As the North Western Railway's number 4 would say, just pathetic. In conclusion, I can't recommend the Outeniqua Choo Tjoe add-on in Train Simulator, unless you like a semi-challenging driving experience or you're heavily interested in obscure railways, or at least lines that may be locally famous but obscure to foreigners. While the concept is great, being a 3-foot 6-inch gauge line in South Africa and all that, it could have been executed in a much better way. The route is spoiled by the bad scenery, reused Kuju assets, limited rolling stock selection, and severely underwhelming sounds on the one locomotive you actually get. Needless to say, this is not worth the full asking price of 36 New Zealand dollars, not by a long shot, and I would go so far as to say that this route is freeware quality.